In 1349, an English peasant did something that, a year earlier, could have gotten him whipped or worse. He looked the man who legally owned his labor dead in the eye and said, "No, not for that wage. Pay me triple, or I'll walk to the next village, where they will." And the Lord paid. Stop and think about how impossible that was. A year before, this man was a serf, property, in everything but name, tied to a patch of land he did not own, working it from the day he could walk until the day he died, just like his father and his father before him. He could not leave. He could not bargain. He could not dream of more. And then the deadliest catastrophe in human history swept across Europe, and somehow, it made him rich. Here's what I want you to picture, because it's exactly where this is going. Within a single generation, a man like this, a former serf, someone who was legally owned, could be buying up land out from under a struggling nobleman, eating meat while the Lord worked his own fields, wealthier than the master his family had served for centuries. The very bottom of the world, and the very top of it, passing each other on the way. And the engine behind all of it wasn't a war, or a king, or even the plague itself. It was a single cold financial law, maybe the most important rule in all of money. The price of anything comes down to one thing: how scarce it is. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It made the one asset the poor had to sell, their own labor, suddenly violently rare, and rare things get expensive. So by the end, you'll see how a plague rewrote the price of human work, how peasants turned that into real wealth and land, what the nobility did to try to crush the price back down, and how it all exploded into revolt. Because this isn't really a story about a disease. It's a story about money, told through the people who lived it, because every fortune has a story. And this is the story of the fortune that death itself handed to the poor. Let me introduce you to a man we'll call John. You won't find him in a history book. He's a stand-in for millions of real English peasants who lived exactly this. But everything that happens to John is drawn straight from the record. To understand John's story, you first have to understand the cage he was born into, the feudal system. Medieval Europe ran on it. At the top sat the king, below him the nobles and lords who held the land, and at the very bottom the vast majority of everyone sat the serfs, people like John. A serf was not quite a slave, but it was close. John was bound to his lord's manor. He worked the lord's fields, handed over part of his own harvest, paid fees even to grind his grain or to marry, and could not leave without permission. You were born a serf, you died a serf, and your children inherited the same fate. And here is the cruel part, the part that explains everything that comes next. In the early 1300s, Europe was overcrowded, far more people than there was, good land to feed them, and when workers are everywhere and cheap, they are treated as worthless. If John complained, there were 10 others begging to take his place. John's labor was the cheapest thing in the world. Then, in 1347, ships carrying rats and fleas carrying a bacterium called Yersinia pestis arrived in Europe's ports, and within a few years the world John knew simply ended. The Black Death moved with a speed that broke people's minds. You could be healthy at breakfast and dead by nightfall. The black swellings, the fever, the bodies piling faster than anyone could bury them. Whole villages emptied. In some places, there were not enough living to dig graves for the dead. By the time the worst of it passed, at least a third of Europe was gone. In England, perhaps 2 million people. Think about that. Not a war, not a famine that takes the week over years, but a third of everyone you know, gone in a matter of months. People genuinely believed it was the end of the world. One chronicler wrote a line that captures it perfectly. The world, he said, would never again be as it was before. He had no idea how right he was, though not at all in the way he meant. Because once the dying slowed, something began to happen that nobody in power had predicted. And it started in the fields. Remember why John's labor had been worthless? Because there were too many workers. Well, now a third of those workers were in the ground. The field still needed plowing. The harvest still needed bringing in. The sheep still needed shearing. But suddenly there were almost no hands left to do it. And just like that, the cheapest thing in the world became the most valuable. John's labor, the same labor a lord could once command for almost nothing, was now scarce. And scarcity is power. This is the oldest law in economics, supply and demand, playing out in its rawest possible form. When the supply of workers collapsed, the price of work shot up. The exact same force you saw a few years ago, when labor shortages after a global pandemic suddenly let workers everywhere demand higher pay. 600 years apart, identical rule. For the first time in the history of his family, John could say no. Picture it. You're John. You're standing in the same field your father and your grandfather broke their backs in, and the Lord's steward rides up and tells you to get to work for the usual pay. The pay your family has always taken. And this time with your heart hammering because a year ago this thought alone could have gotten you flogged. You shake your head. Not for that. Pay me 3 times as much, or I'll go work for the manor down the road that will. And you watch the steward's face change, because you both know you mean it, and you both know there is no one else left to bring the harvest in. For 1,000 years, men like you had no leverage at all. You just realized you're holding all of it, and John was not alone. Across England, lords who had spent their whole lives barking orders suddenly found their workers turning up their noses at the old wages. The records are full of it. One account complains that the common people had become so picky they could barely be persuaded to serve their betters at all, unless they were paid triple. Triple, wages didn't creep up, they exploded, and it got better for John, and worse for the lord. John worked fewer days, not the back-breaking 260-odd he used to grind through, but maybe 80, 100. He ate meat now, not just bread. He wore better clothes. And if his lord wouldn't meet his price, he walked down the road to the next manor, where a desperate landowner would pay anything for a working pair of hands. There's a detail from the period I find almost funny. Some lords and high clergymen, men who'd never done a day of physical labor, were reduced to working their own fields because they couldn't find or afford anyone else. The masters were sweating in the dirt. The world had turned upside down. And this wasn't just grumbling. It's in the actual court records. Real laborers, named in the documents, simply downed their tools, walked off their lord's land, and went looking for better pay, sometimes whole groups on the very same day. The chain that had bound their families for centuries was snapping, one defiant worker at a time. But this is where it goes from surprising to genuinely staggering, because John didn't just earn more. Some peasants got rich. Here's how, and notice that this is the exact same move that wealthy people make in every crisis, right up to today. When 1/3 of the population dies, they leave things behind: empty cottages, abandoned farms, land with no owner and no one to work it. Prices for real assets, land, property, collapsed because there were no buyers and endless supply. And the surviving peasants, the ones with a little coin saved from those tripled wages, did the smartest thing you can do in a crisis. While everyone else was paralyzed, they bought up real productive assets for almost nothing. If you saw the last episode of this channel, this should sound familiar. It's the same logic that let one man become the richest in Weimar Germany while everyone else was wiped out. When panic crushes the price of real things, the people brave enough to buy them inherit the future. A man like John could buy the farm of a dead neighbor, then another, until he held real land of his own. Dozens of acres, sometimes 100. These newly landed peasants got a name: yeoman. Free men who owned their land outright, owed labor to no one, and collected the profit themselves. And here's the line that this whole story turns on. A yeoman, a man whose grandfather had been an unfree serf, could now be wealthier than the lord up the hill. Picture that lord. His rents collapsed because half his tenants were dead. The survivors were demanding wages he couldn't pay. His fields lay half empty, and his grand income had withered. Meanwhile, the former serf down the road was buying up land and eating like a noble. The poor were rising. The mighty were sinking. They passed each other on the way. And the nobility could see it, and it horrified them. Peasants were now wearing fine cloth and furs that had always marked the upper class. The rich were so rattled, they passed laws dictating what ordinary people were allowed to wear, trying to make the classes look different from the outside, precisely because, in the purse, they no longer were. You cannot, it turns out, legislate someone back into looking poor. If you're enjoying watching the feudal order get turned on its head, and honestly, who isn't, take half a second to subscribe, and drop a like while you're at it. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. This channel is built on exactly these stories, the moments when money flips the whole world over. Now, you can probably guess that the people at the top did not take this lying down. To the lords and the king, this was not supply and demand. It was something terrifying. The bottom of society climbing toward the top, the sacred order of things dissolving, and they decided to stop it, by law. In England, the response came fast. The Statute of Labourers of 1351, pushed through under King Edward III, and what it tried to do was, frankly, breathtaking. It froze wages, rolled them back to pre-plague levels, as if 1/3 of the workforce hadn't just died. It made it a crime to ask for higher pay, and a crime to offer it, and it tried to chain workers to their villages. Runaways could be hunted down, dragged back, fined, even branded. Read that again. The most powerful people in the country looked at a free market that had finally, for once, swung in favor of the poor, and they tried to make that market illegal. They tried to legislate the peasantry back into servitude. And here's the satisfying part. It didn't work. The law was widely ignored by the peasants, obviously, but also by the very lords meant to enforce it. A landowner desperate for workers would happily pay over the legal wage in secret, just to get his harvest in first. The market was stronger than the statute. You cannot legislate scarcity out of existence. But it stayed on the books, enforced just often enough to keep the resentment burning. For 30 years, that anger simmered, and then it boiled over. By 1381, England was broke. The 100 Years' War with France had drained the treasury, so the government reached for the oldest bad idea in history. It taxed the poor to pay for the rich man's war. A brutal poll tax, a flat fee on nearly every adult, regardless of how little they had. For a laborer, it could swallow 2 weeks of wages. It was the spark on 3 decades of dry tinder. In 1381, tens of thousands of peasants from Kent and Essex rose up, what we now call the Peasants Revolt, led by a man named Wat Tyler and a radical preacher named John Ball, who asked a question that still echoes today: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? In other words, who decided some men are born to rule and others to serve? This was no quiet protest. The rebels marched on London, stormed the Tower itself, the most secure fortress in the kingdom, executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the royal treasurer, and forced the 14-year-old king, Richard II, to face them in person and hear their demands: an end to serfdom, and the freedom to rent land like free men. The revolt itself was ultimately crushed. Wat Tyler was killed. The king's promises were broken almost as soon as they were made. In the short term, the rebels lost. But in the long run, they had already won, and so had John, because no law could undo the simple arithmetic of the plague. There were still too few workers, and too much land. Wages stayed high. Serfdom, that ancient cage, kept rotting from the inside, and over the next century it faded from England altogether. The yeoman class, those landowning former peasants, became the seed of a rural middle class that would outlast every lord who tried to crush it. The feudal world never came back. That chronicler was right. The world would never again be as it was before. Now I'd be lying if I left it there, because there's a darker truth underneath this. This golden age for the common worker was built on a mountain of corpses. The only reason John could demand triple wages is that a third of his neighbors were dead. This wasn't justice arriving, it was a catastrophe so total it accidentally rebalanced the scales. And the plague years brought out the worst in people too. Terrified communities looked for someone to blame and turned on minorities in some of the most horrific persecutions of the age. Death on this scale doesn't just free people, it scars them. But the economic lesson underneath it is timeless, and it's the same one this channel comes back to again and again. The value of anything, gold, land, even a human being's labor, comes down to how scarce it is. When workers were everywhere, they were treated as nothing. When the plague made them rare, they became powerful, and no king or law could change that. Power doesn't follow who deserves it. It follows what's scarce. And John, the serf who once couldn't leave his village without permission, lived out his days a free man, on land he owned, that he would pass to his children. His grandchildren would grow up never knowing what it meant to belong to another man. They would never call anyone lord. The cage their great-grandfather was born into was simply gone. So tell me in the comments, if you'd lived through it, would you have done what John did? Walked off your lord's land, gambled everything on a wage that the law itself said was a crime? I read every comment, and I'd love to know. And if you want more stories like this, where a single catastrophe quietly rewrites who's rich and who's ruined, subscribe to Fortunes in Ruin, because every fortune